Hello everyone. Hopefully everyone is doing okay. Hopefully everyone found the tests to be okay, and hopefully you did well on your hospital procedures test. As promised, we will be trying an online lecture today. I'll be posting it as a video. We'll try something new, something different. Hopefully this will help. And then this will follow by a discussion post on DC Connect. You can ask any questions related to the respiratory system. As you can see, this is the system we will now be focusing on. And any questions along the way, I will post the discussion after. And regarding the quiz, it is still to be determined whether or not it will be in class. As you can see right now, the weather is picking up. So I will determine that. Please stay tuned on DC Connect this evening, and we'll give you an update. But as of right now, the expectation is everyone should be attending class tomorrow to write the quiz. Alright, that being said, as you can see, we're studying the respiratory system here. Just want everyone to take a deep breath. That's what we're going to be learning about today. Not how to take a deep breath, but what happens when you're taking a breath. What is the anatomy and physiology behind that? And the objective for this lecture is just to name the organs and structures of the respiratory system and describe their locations and functions. So you're going to learn what happens when you inhale, exhale, the process of it, the organs involved with it, the location, and the functions. This is very vital to know because obviously we all breathe. It's involuntary. We need to know what's going on here, and breathing is involuntary. Like I mentioned, it's something that you don't think about. Is something that's essential to life and is essential to obtain energy by respiration. And how is this going to happen? Well, we are going to learn about it right now. So respiration, that is the process. It's known as respiration. Don't get it confused with inhalation or exhalation. It's a process called respiration. There's two types of it. The first one is external respiration. And what is that? Well, it's an exchange of air at the lung, and this involves inhalation and exhalation. So the process of respiration externally is by inhaling and exhaling. Of course, that we inhale the oxygen and we exhale the carbon dioxide. It occurs between the environments, such as the air that we're breathing, and the blood in the capillaries of the lungs. So between inhaling and exhaling, all the processes involved, this is known as external respiration. Right? If you think about it, keep in mind that not all of the air contains 100% oxygen. It contains many other things such as sulfur, nitrogen, pollution. As you can tell, if you live in a more developed area, there will be more pollution. Therefore, the air does not contain as much pure oxygen as required. In fact, it's only 21% of inhaled air is containing oxygen, and then we exhale 16% of it. So roughly, we're only looking at about 5% of the oxygen that we inhale is going to be used for energy for our vital functions. Not as much as you think. And now we have internal respiration, completely different from external respiration. And this involves gas exchange at the cell level between the blood and various tissues. So in this case, muscle tissue, skin. So what that means is when we inhale and our body takes in the oxygen that is needed via the blood and goes back to the heart, and then it gets spread out to whatever tissue it's needed. In this case, muscle tissue. So if you're exercising a lot, think about this, right? Our heart rate increases, our blood flow increases. We need more oxygen that needs to be sent back to the heart, and then the blood is pumped to whatever muscle we're working. So for instance, if you're running, you're taking in all of this oxygen during rapid inhalation and exhalation, and then it gets sent to the legs, where in this case, we will be using the oxygen for energy in order for us to move, in order to keep up with whatever type of exercise is needed. So that's just one example right there. Alright, so if you can see here, this is a diagram of the respiratory system. I'm going to take you along through the journey of air and what happens along the way, what structures and organs are involved. This is a diagram that you should be labeling and understanding at some point. You won't see it on the quiz tomorrow, but do expect to see it on the test or anything similar. But in this situation, I'm going to take you through the diagram step by step. As you can see, there's many different labels here, 22 different labels. So we'll go through it step by step, and we'll take you through it. So the first one is the nose. Air is inhaled through the nose. The proper way of breathing requires you to inhale through your nose and exhale through the mouth. Right? Why do you ask? Well, if you think about it, there are nose hairs in our nose, and what they do is they filter out any debris that might be in the air that we are inhaling. So once we inhale that, it goes through the nasal cavity. Right? So the nasal cavity is an area where the air gets warm, gets lubricated, and further debris is removed. We contain a lot of cilia, which I will explain throughout this presentation. And then we have our paranasal sinuses. So in this situation, what they do is they help keep the bones hollow, and they do contain mucous membranes. In this situation, just assistance in the air that we're breathing throughout the respiratory tract. And then the air is eventually going to hit the nasal pharynx, right? So we did talk about this a little bit in the digestive unit. The nasal pharynx is the part of the pharynx involved in the nasal area, right? So the air will continue to go through the nasal pharynx, and then along the way we're going to see adenoids, right? So we talked a little bit about that in the lymphatic system. That's just labeled on there. And then also the air will continue into the oral pharynx. So this is the part of the pharynx where the oral cavity is in this situation, and what will happen is you'll see that there's tonsils as well. So once again, this is all part of a different system, but this is something that you necessarily don't have to understand in the respiratory system. It's just labeled. And then the air will eventually hit the pharynx, right? So this is where air starts to make its way into the windpipe. Keep in mind that food also enters here as well. So the pharynx is shared by the food and the air that we are taking in our system. And then number 9, we have the larynx, right? Also known as the voice box. So as you can hear my voice right now, my larynx is very active, a lot of vibration going on. Right, it does contain a little slit in the middle known as the glottis, and just to keep in mind that we always need the glottis to remain open. We need some type of opening in our larynx in order to allow the air to enter our system, enter the windpipe in this situation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then number 10 is the esophagus, right? So this is where we don't want air entering. If it does, it will most likely result in someone burping, right? We want all of the air entering into the trachea and the windpipe. And then number 11, we cannot forget about the epiglottis. Very, very important in the respiratory system. Just a reminder, the epiglottis functions as when we are inhaling air, our epiglottis will remain open so it can enter the trachea via the larynx. Right? And then what will happen is when we are eating food, the epiglottis will remain closed in order to prohibit any food entering our windpipe. So I'm pretty sure we have all heard the example when food goes down the wrong pipe. This is your epiglottis open at the time that you are consuming food, and as a result may enter the larynx and the trachea and will result in choking. That's why it's recommended that you chew your food very slowly, take your time eating to prevent any type of choking hazards similar to this. And if we move on, you'll see the air finally hits the trachea. So this is the windpipe. This is where the air starts to make its way down into the lungs, and then the air will eventually be dispersed throughout the entire lung, the respiratory tract via the bronchioles and the bronchi, bronchioles, which I'll get into any moment. And then number 13, you can see we have the mediastinum. So if we remember, the sternum, the breastbone, had a part of it named the mediastinum. And if you really think about this, what's happening is that the breastbone is in front or anterior in this situation of the trachea. If you think about this, if someone were to apply a lot of force at your breastbone, or for example, someone were to punch you right in the middle of the chest, you have the breastbone protecting your trachea. We never want the trachea to be damaged. We don't want any type of damage related to the way we intake and output the air, right? We don't want any type of damage to the trachea, so that's why we have the breastbone. It's there for protection of the windpipe. And then number 14, you can see we are getting into the bronchial tubes, also known as the bronchi. And this is where the windpipe starts to branch off. So just imagine the trachea, the trachea, my apologies, being the tree stem, the main tree stem, and then the bronchi being the branches coming right off the stem. And then those branches will branch off even more, which will eventually get to the bronchioles, which we'll talk about in a moment. But before we get there, number 15 is labeled as the lung, right? So one thing you have to keep in mind is that the lungs always contain air. Think about a balloon that is always inflated. If we didn't have any air in that balloon, it would be completely deflated. Same concept with the lungs. We always have air in the lungs. And when I did my undergrad, we talked about how much air was left in the lungs, how much air we're intaking, how much we're exhaling. We all did that by volume, right? So how many milliliters of air we were taking in. I won't get into that specifically, but in this situation, the lungs are always filled with air. And then if you look at number 16, now this is the further branching known as the bronchiole. And then number 16, I have it labeled as the terminal bronchiole. So if you look at the little square that's zooming into the picture that's above, that's below number 16, you'll see that they branch even further into bronchioles. So it's called the terminal bronchiole because think of this once again, if you're in Toronto and you're taking the TTC subway, the end station at one line is called the terminal station. So in this case, the terminal bronchiole is the final branch right before we hit the alveoli. And this is very important. This is the air sac that basically allows gas exchange to occur. So we have a lot of them, about 300 million different alveoli, alveolus being singular, but this is where gas exchange is occurring. So now we can make the connection in the cardiovascular system once the blood left the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery and then eventually made it to the lungs for gas exchange. This is where the gas exchange is occurring. And if you look at the blue arrows in the pulmonary arteriole, you can see they are directed towards the alveoli, and this is where we have the deoxygenated blood coming from our heart. And then what happens, if you look at one of the alveoli, it is covered by the capillaries. And so deoxygenated blood will enter into the alveoli, keeping in mind that the deoxygenated blood will contain carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of all the energy that we produce. So what happens is that it goes through the capillaries via the pulmonary arteriole, and then gas exchange occurs. And then we have oxygen-rich blood. So our blood is finally oxygenated, and then it can return to the heart via the pulmonary venule, pulmonary vein, and then back into the left atrium. This is now making the connections. I was explaining in class how some of these systems are going to make connections. We're finally starting to see some connections here. And if you look to the picture on the left here, where I will point at number 18, that is the capillaries surrounding the individual alveolus, alveolus being one. And if you look in the vein, in the pulmonary venule, you can see the red blood cells, they're giving up the CO2. They're releasing the carbon dioxide, and then along the way, they are going to be taking in the oxygen that we just inhaled, right? So why do we need air? Well, why do we need oxygen? It's due to the fact that when we inhale it, we take that oxygen from the air and then exhale it as carbon dioxide. I could get into it a little bit further, but the carbon dioxide that we exhale is used by plants for photosynthesis, and then oxygen is their byproduct. So it's completely reverse. Photosynthesis is different than cellular respiration, but this isn't biology here. I won't get too in-depth into it, but I'm just giving you an idea of how the oxygen and carbon dioxide is basically cycled throughout all the ecosystems throughout our entire Earth, which is fascinating. And then, of course, we have the erythrocytes being number 19. So once again, the red blood cells, they give up the carbon dioxide in exchange for the oxygen that they take in, and then goes back to the heart, ending up in the left atrium. And then eventually the blood is pumped to the rest of the body. Alright, and we're going to talk about some lung layers. So the lung does contain 2 layers, and number 20 is the parietal pleura. So this, we'll get into it a little bit more, but the lung does have a double membrane covering, and the parietal is the outer membrane layer of the lung, and then 21 is the visceral pleura. So this is more the inner. Alright, now we're going to talk about a few terms that I did mention in the previous slide. The first one, we're going to talk about cilia. Alright, what are cilia? Well, what they are, they're basically fine hairs, microprojections on mucous membranes of the nasal cavity and the larynx. And it functions to filter out foreign bodies, debris, and warms the air. So I did bring this up earlier, but we have cilia in our nasal cavity, and we also have it in the larynx. And what it is doing is basically taking out any type of junk, any type of crap that's in the air in order for our body not to accept it, because we don't want to be taking in anything that could be harmful to the body. So our body is very smart in recognizing that. And one good example I could bring up is people who are chronic smokers. You have probably heard of people having smoker's cough. Well, what that is that because they're smoking so much, they have damaged the cilia in their larynx. So their larynx and the trachea, I should even add, I should have put trachea as well, but it is also contained in the trachea, in the windpipe. All the cilia is damaged due to chronic smoking. So the reason why people have smoker's cough is because they have to cough up all the junk that the cilia should have been doing for their body in the first place, right? So that's why people have the smoker's cough. If you smoke a lot, you have completely damaged all of your cilia in the windpipe. And now we're going to talk about the sinuses. So the paranasal one we talked about, it was hollow air-containing spaces within the skull, and they contain mucous membranes and produce mucus for lubrication. Right, so there is, I'm pretty sure we've all had sinus infections, right? A lot of mucus is being released. We're coughing up a lot of mucus when we have sinus infections. They produce mucus for lubrication. So we want this air to be lubricated, right? We can't just strictly inhale the air, right? It could be too dry sometimes. So if you're in a drier environment, this is a huge advantage for sinuses to lubricate the air a little bit, right? Because you got to remember, everything, any hollow object in our body is usually surrounded by mucous membrane. It just allows better flow, better lubrication, just a nice flow overall. And they also lighten the bones of the skull and help produce the sound. So in this situation, if we're talking and you hearing your voice, even your sinuses will play a role in that. And we're just going to talk about some of the structures I've already mentioned, but we just have them in term form for you right here. So the first one being the larynx, which are the vocal cords, and they vibrate and produce the sound. So once again, you're hearing my voice. My larynx is very active at this moment. And it contains cartilage for support. So once again, the cartilage being that very thick and dense tissue, even our windpipe, our trachea has it. It has to be very structured. We want to think about a very hard pipe, right? A very dense pipe. If you want that pipe to be hollow and very stable, it has to be very dense. And then the epiglottis, I've talked about it so much, you all are probably experts on the epiglottis now. So it's a flap of cartilage attached to the tongue base, so right underneath underneath the back end of the tongue, and then it closes over the larynx during swallowing, right? So I've explained this. If it's open while you're eating, it goes down the wrong tube, the wrong pipe, and can result in a choking hazard. And then next we have the trachea, which is also known as the windpipe. And the air enters and exits the lungs via the trachea. So the trachea is the main passageway into and out of the lungs. This is your tree stem right here. And they contain C-shaped cartilage rings, which are made of fibrous connective tissue. That's what cartilage is made of, to keep the windpipe hollow and open. Right? If we had very soft tissue in the windpipe, it would basically condense and collapse, and we wouldn't be able to properly inhale and exhale the air. So it's very dense, very structured, right? That's probably an important reason why they contain the C-shaped cartilage rings, is you don't want it to collapse. You don't ever want your trachea or windpipe to collapse. We need to breathe. We are not living if we're not breathing, if there isn't any respiration going on at the time, right? But we also have the breastbone in front of it for a little bit more protection. And then also the alveolus, alveoli being plural. These are the air sacs, so they are as small as one cell epithelium in size. We're talking about as small as a red blood cell, maybe even smaller than that. They're so tiny. And this is where gas exchange is occurring. And there's over 300 million of them in the lungs. Alright, so if you think about this, if we were to inhale more deeply, so if you were to take a very deep breath like me right now, and then exhale, we are activating more alveoli at the time, right? Because we're taking in more air, we need more alveoli in order for gas exchange to occur. That's why it is encouraged to do deep breathing. You want to activate all the lung, as much of the lung as possible, right? It gives you, your breathing is more efficient and you're taking in more energy. So people who practice deep breathing, so I know that's a function in yoga and different aerobics. It is fundamental to take deep breaths, to focus and concentrate on your breathing, right? Because you want to make sure that you're taking in the most air at the time so we can get the most oxygen and we can have the most energy production possible, right? The better you breathe, the more energetic you'll be. It's as simple as that. But I know it's very hard to concentrate on our breathing sometimes, but it's definitely something that we should keep in mind. If your mind isn't occupied by anything else, just really focus on your breathing and just realize how good it feels when you take a deep inhale through your nose and exhale out of your mouth. Alright, moving on here. This is just a picture explaining how the larynx works. So if you look at the diagram that says open, you can see the epiglottis is directly underneath the tongue. So there's the little flappy area. And then the opening in the middle there is known as the glottis, right? So this is where the air will make its way into the trachea. And then also you can see it's surrounded by cartilage. And then right at the bottom of the open diagram, you'll see the vocal folds are abducted. So remember, abduction is movement away from the midline. So abduction, you can see the vocal cords are active. So that's how my vocal cords will look like right now, because I'm talking and I'm lecturing and just presenting this information to you. And then if you look to the right here, you'll see the vocal folds have adducted. So they have returned closer to the midline. This is when we're not talking, not using our voice. But keep in mind, we have to have some type of opening in order for air to enter into the trachea. So it's not entirely closed all the time. This is something to keep in mind. We'll move on here. A few more terms. They're all going to make connections to the diagram that I just explained. If anything, it's just more detailed information. So the pleura is a double-layered membrane surrounding each lung. The outer layer, like I mentioned earlier, is the parietal pleura, and then the inner layer is the visceral pleura. And then they also contain a pleural cavity, which contains thin watery fluid, moistens the pleura, and decreases friction between the lungs and the thorax. So this is just, think of it as just a system or a membrane just to reduce any type of friction in the area surrounding the lung, right? So we want to make sure our lungs can freely move in our thorax, right? We don't want our lungs always being contained in one spot, because if you think about it, our lungs expand when we inhale, and then they condense when we exhale. So we need to make sure that there isn't a lot of friction going on, because our lungs are moving all the time. They don't stop. Right, so we need to make sure there's a little bit of a fluid just to reduce friction. And then the lungs. So, interesting point. The right lung contains 3 lobes, and the left lung contains 2 lobes. The upper portion of the lung is called the apex, and the lower portion is called the base. And then also there's something called the hilum. Hilus is singular. So what this is the midline region where blood vessels, nerves, lymph tissue, and bronchial tubes enter and exit. I will show you a picture in a moment to give you a better understanding of what the hilum is. But before I do that, I just wanted to explain. Maybe some of you are thinking, why does the left lung only contain 2 lobes and the right lung only contains 3? Well, the reason being is because where our heart is positioned, it's tucked right underneath one of the lobes of the lung. And so the way our lungs are developed, or the way they're structured, is that the left lung is only going to contain 2 lobes, because if you were to go and look back at that diagram, you would see that there's a little section that just to properly insert the lungs, just right underneath it, right near the base area. So go back and take a look at that diagram, and you'll probably have a better understanding as to why the left lung contains 2 lobes. Okay, go into this picture right here. If you look at the very middle, this is a picture of the right lung, but right at the very middle is the hilum, right? So if you take a look, you have the bronchus, you have the, what do we have here? We have the various arteries, right? So we have the pulmonary arteries and veins, right? We have all that stuff going on. So this is where all the vessels are entering and exiting, right? But right in the middle, you can see it's called the hilum. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation, also known as inspiration, this is where the diaphragm contracts and descends. So when we are inhaling, the diaphragm is actually contracting, but it's descending. It's moving down. Why is it moving down? Well, the thoracic cavity has to increase and expand. So when we're inhaling, our lungs are being filled with air. And what happens is that the diaphragm has to move down in order to allow expansion of the lungs and the thorax. And then also internal air pressure decreases due to an expansion. And then air flows into the lungs to equalize pressure. So what's happening? There isn't a lot of pressure, because you don't want any type of pressure competing against the high amount of pressure that's being entered into the lungs via the air, right? Because if you think about it, think about yourself inhaling, right? That's a very powerful amount of pressure entering the lungs, right? So in order for that to happen, our lungs are going to expand and the diaphragm is going to contract down. In that case, there's less pressure in the area surrounding the lungs in order for our lungs to expand. And then we have exhalation, also known as expiration. So this is where the diaphragm relaxes and moves back up. So when it moves back up, if you think about it, the air is starting to be exhaled, and then our lungs are going to shrink again, right? Because there isn't as much air as there was when we inhaled. So in that case, the thoracic cavity decreases in size. And if in this situation, just sit there and breathe and look at your thorax, right? If you inhale, you'll see your chest expands, and then when you exhale, your chest compresses, right? And so the diaphragm is basically pushing the lungs back up in order to basically allow all that air to exit our lungs. And in this case, the thoracic air pressure increases, right? We want that thoracic air pressure to increase in order to push all that air out of the lungs and then through our mouth. and then the air is expelled out of the lungs to equalize the pressure. Okay, so what I would encourage you to do with regards to inhalation and exhalation is to search up some animations on Google if you're not understanding what's going on here. I know I'm explaining it using words, and obviously there's some pictures here which will help, but it's just good to see how the lungs move when they're inhaling and exhaling consistently. I couldn't get something up on the PowerPoint here, but it is something that I recommend that you try and look at, and just to give you a better visual, right? We need to understand what's going on here. It's very ideal just to know how is this working, right? We are all human beings, and we all have bodies that, you know, we should know how it works, right? And I feel this course is just very ideal just to understand how your body works. And of course, all of you working in the medical office administration field is just going to give you that advantage to understand how your body's working. So when you read the reports, you can make the connections and the relations and everything. Okay, before we finish here, we are going to take a look at the pathway of air from the nose to the capillaries of the lungs. So this is just inhalation, but think of exhalation being the complete opposite of what I'm going to show you now. So the first part is the nose, nares being the nostrils. That's another name for it. And then we have the nasal cavities and paranasal sinuses. And then entering the pharynx, where there are also adenoids and tonsils along the way. And then the larynx, where the epiglottis controls our movement of air. And then we enter the trachea via the bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli, and then the lung capillaries, the bloodstream, right? So this is where the oxygen is going to be taken into the blood, and then we take out that carbon dioxide out of the blood, and then it gets exhaled, and then all that wonderful stuff happens continuously. Okay, that's it for now. Hopefully that was very informative, and hopefully this is something that you enjoyed. I may consider doing this again for test number 4, rather than you having to stay after. We can just do this again. So give me your feedback on this. Let me know how you like it. And we have the following questions that you should attempt in pages 485 to 486 of your text, and that's A and B. Complete the respiratory system diagram on page 459 of the text. Like I mentioned, either that or in the diagram that it's bracketed as optional. What I really want to achieve here is to make sure you're seeing all of this in color. That's why I wasn't going to give you a black and white diagram in class. I think this is just something that you need to see in color, especially when there's so many different things to label. And the question sheet is available on DC Connect. Hopefully everything works out for tomorrow. I look out my window right now. It's not snowing, but it's not 3 o'clock yet, and we'll see what happens. But as it stands right now, you are expected to come into class. Please stay tuned on DC Connect for any further updates. But as of right now, quiz number 8 tomorrow. Number 8, I believe. Yeah, number 8. And on all of this information here. And remember, you don't need to remember the diagram labels, right? I just went through that just to give you an understanding of how it works. Okay, well, thank you so much. Hopefully you enjoy this, and have yourself a great day.